Okay, if you're watching this video, it's because you needed some help with worksheet 6.3. I already did one video where we did 9 through 13. Today I'm going to focus on 15 through 33, the odds. So let's look at 15. So on 15, the directions say multiply and simplify. So again, I'm going to use my scratch paper because I can't get all my work on these little bitty spaces. So I'm going to go multiply. On the top, I can tell that it's just a FOIL problem. So I'm going to do sine times sine. And sine times sine is going to give me sine squared. And then I'm going to do sine times cosine. And that's going to give me cosine sine. And some of y'all want to write sine cosine. That's fine. Order doesn't matter. Now I'm going to go multiply everything by cosine. So I'm going to have cosine times sine, and cosine times sine is cosine sine again. Okay. And then I'm going to multiply cosine times cosine, and cosine times cosine is cosine squared. And then at the very end, they want me to write down a minus 1 to the back. So minus 1. And that's all over, the original problem is all over sine cosine. Alright, so looking at the top, I'm going to see if anything cancels or if I combine anything. So I do notice that I have a cosine sine and another cosine sine. So I have two of them. I also see that I have a sine squared plus a cosine squared. Alright, so I'm going to rearrange these. On top, we have two cosine sines. I have one cosine sine and another cosine sine, so I have two of them. I've got a sine squared theta and a cosine squared theta. And then I'm going to bring down that minus 1. And it's all over sine theta, cosine theta. So now I'm going to start thinking about some of those identities we learned in class yesterday. Yesterday we talked about 3 identities, and one of them was called a Pythagorean identity that I called a Phineas and Ferb. And it said every time you had sine squared plus cosine squared, we could say it was equal to 1. So these were the identities that we did in class yesterday. And right here, I have a sine squared plus a cosine squared. So instead of writing sine squared plus cosine squared, I'm going to write down what it equals, and it equals 1. So I'm going to replace this whole box with the number 1, because sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. Now when I did that, what happens to this one and that one? They're going to cancel. So all I'm going to have left on the top is 2 cosine sine, because these are going to cancel, over cosine sine. Remember, I said you can always write these in any order. So I have 2 cosine sines divided by 1 cosine sine. The cosine sines cancel, and my answer is 2. Okay, so that is problem number 15. The next one I'm going to look at with you is problem number 17. So go look at 17. The directions for 17 say factor and simplify. So you have to remember how to factor. When I do problems that are factoring, if it has only one word in it, like the top has sine, the bottom has sine, then just for the factoring part, I like to change the word sine to be a variable. And the variable I'm going to pick is x. So I'm going to rewrite this as 3x squared plus 4x plus 1. So everywhere I saw sine, I just replaced it with an x. So sine squared is now x squared, sine is now x. All over sine squared is x 2 sine would be 2x, and then I have plus 1. So we've factored many times before. You did this in Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. When you factor, you're trying to figure out what did I multiply together to get 3x squared plus 4x plus 1. All right, so strategies here. I know that these first two numbers, when I multiply them together, have to give me a 3. Well, the only way to get a 3 is 3 times 1. So I know I need a 3x and a 1x, because 3x times x is 3x squared. That's your first strategy. The next thing I know is when I multiply these last two numbers at the back, they have to multiply together to give me a 1. Well, the only way to get a 1 is a 1 times a 1. And then all you have to do now is check, and you're going to check by foiling. So I'm going to do a little check in my head here. 3x times x is 3x squared. That one worked. 3x times 1 is 3x, and 1 times x is x. So 3x plus x is 4x. Check, that worked. And then 1 times 1 is 1. So it worked. I just FOILed it back out, and I got what I started with. Now I'm going to do the bottom. We're going to start the same way. I know I'm going to multiply two things together, and I know that whatever my first two numbers are, when I multiply these two numbers together, I have to get a 1x squared. Well, the only way to get a 1x squared is x times x. All right, I know the last two numbers here have to multiply together to give me a 1. Well, the only way to get a 1 is a 1 times a 1. And then we do our check again. So here we go. X times x is x squared. Check. X times 1 is 1x. 1 times x is 1x. X plus x is 2x. Check. 1 times 1 is 1. Okay, so I have now factored correctly. After factoring, it says factor and simplify. Well, I can get rid of stuff. I have an x plus 1 on the top, and I have an x plus 1 on the bottom. So these are going to cancel out, and we're left with 3x plus 1 over x plus 1. The only thing left to do is to go rewrite my problem with sign instead of x. So everywhere I see an x, I'm going to replace it with the word sign. So 3 sine theta plus 1 over sine theta plus 1. And that is your final answer. Okay, so let's flip the page and go look at the next section. On the rest of the worksheet, on 19 through 33, the odds, the directions are going to be simple. Establish each identity. So here's what that means. You have to prove that the left side actually does equal what it says on the right side. And that's all we have to do. My hint, when you are working problems 19 through 33, the first thing you want to do is try to rewrite everything in terms of sine and cosine. And a lot of times, if you'll just rewrite everything in sine and cosine, the answers just pop out. They just kind of happen. So let's look at number 19 to see what I'm talking about. So on 19, I'm going to multiply cosecant times cosine. And when I do, I'm going to hopefully get cotangent. Remember, we're trying to prove the left side equals the right side. So my first step on number 19 is going to be to rewrite cosecant and cosine using only the words sine and cosine. So I can write cosecant as 1 over sine theta, and cosine is just cosine over 1. Okay, so now I have two fractions. I'm going to multiply top times top and bottom times bottom. And I have cosine over sine. And what do I know cosine over sine equals? We know that equals cotangent. I just made the left side equal the right side. 19's done. Okay, let's go do another one. Let's go do number 21. Again, my goal is to make the left side equal the right side. So I want to make 1 plus tangent squared equal secant squared. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite 1 plus tangent squared so that it only uses the words sine and cosine. So I'm going to have 1 plus, I'm going to rewrite tangent as sine over cosine. But it's a squared, so I'm going to do sine squared over cosine squared. So that's step 1. Rewrite everything in terms of sine and cosine. Well, now I'm trying to add 1 to a fraction, so I have to get a common denominator. So my denominator is going to be a cosine. The only way to get 1 with a cosine is cosine squared over cosine squared. Because anything divided by itself is 1. Plus, I'm going to write this fraction back down, sine squared over cosine squared. Okay, so now that I have a common denominator, I can add the tops. So we have cosine squared theta plus sine squared theta over cosine squared theta. I'm adding the tops. And right here, you see a Phineas and Ferb. We see cosine squared plus sine squared. And every time we see cosine squared plus sine squared, same stuff, just different order, I'm going to replace these two words with the number what? 1. So I'm going to rewrite this as 1 over cosine squared theta. 1 over cosine is how you write the reciprocal for secant. The only difference is it's squared, so this equals secant squared theta. I just made the left side equal the right side. I got exactly what I was supposed to get. So these problems are kind of like I'm giving you the answer and I'm telling you this is what you need to get. Go get it. Let's go look at 23. On 23, they want me to multiply tangent plus cotangent times cosine, and they want my answer to be cosecant. So that's my goal. My goal is to get the answer cosecant. So we're going to start off the same way. I'm going to rewrite everything in terms of cosine and sine. So this already said cosine, so that one's good. The word tangent, I'm going to rewrite as sine over cosine. The word cotangent, I'm going to write as cosine over sine. And now I'm going to go multiply. Remember, cosine is really over 1. I'm going to go multiply the tops of each of these. So when I go to multiply these two right here, I'm going to end up with cosine sine over cosine. Cosine sine over cosine. And when I go do the next one, I'm going to have cosine squared over sine. This one right here, these two cosines are going to cancel on me. All right. So that made it a little easier. So now I have sine theta over 1 plus cosine squared over sine. Now I need to get a common denominator. My common denominator is going to be 1 times sine, which is sine. So I need to multiply this fraction, top and bottom, by sine. This one by 1, because it already has a sign here. Okay? So sine times sine is sine squared. One times cosine squared is cosine squared. And on the bottom, I have my sine. Okay? What do I know cosine squared plus sine squared is? We've done this a couple times, so every time I see sine squared plus cosine squared, I'm going to replace it with the number 1. So now I have 1 over sine theta, and I know 1 over sine theta is a reciprocal to cosecant. Okay, I just made the left side, after I multiplied, equal to cosecant. Okay, so we've done 19, 21, 23. Let's go look at 25. 25, again, everywhere it says tangent and cotangent, I'm going to rewrite as a cosine and sine. This one I think I could actually fit on here. So instead of writing tangent, I'm going to write it as sine over cosine times, they're right next to each other, cotangent is cosine over sine minus cosine squared theta. Okay. When I multiply these together right here, I'm going to get sine cosine over sine cosine. Well, sine cosine over sine cosine, anything divided by itself is a 1. So I have 1 minus cosine squared theta. I know that I can rewrite this 1. I know right here that if I had a 1, I could rewrite it as sine squared plus cosine squared. So in place of this 1 right here, I'm going to write both of these words. So I'm going to write sine squared plus cosine squared. All of that represents the 1. I'm going to bring down my minus cosine squared. So now I'm going to see that the cosine squared and the minus cosine squared cancel, and the only thing I have left is sine squared, which is what I was supposed to get. Check, done. All right, let's look at 27. 27 wants me to FOIL this. When I'm done foiling, I'm supposed to get tangent squared theta. So let's go FOIL. Secant times secant is secant squared. Secant times 1 is secant. Negative 1 times secant is a minus secant. And negative 1 times a positive 1 is a minus 1. Okay. I can see that the secant and the minus secant are going to disappear. So I have secant squared theta minus 1. So I see a secant and a 1, and I think I tan in a second. I tan in a second. So I know that this 1 right here, that one word, I can replace with I tan squared. Okay, so 1 plus tangent squared replaces the secant. And then I bring down my minus 1. My 1's are going to cancel, and what's the only thing I have left? Tangent squared theta. All right, let's do number 29. 29, again, same thing. I'm going to FOIL this, and I want to prove that this whole thing equals 1. All right, so let's go FOIL. Secant times secant, secant squared. Secant times tangent is a negative secant tangent. Tangent times secant is a positive secant tangent. And then tangent times negative tangent is a negative tangent squared. All right, so let's get rid of stuff. Minus secant tan and a positive secant tan cancel out. So I have secant squared minus tangent squared. So I have tangent squared, secant squared. I'm thinking I tan in a second. So it's right here. So I'm going to replace this word right here, secant, with 1 plus tangent squared. All right, so I've got 1 plus tangent squared theta minus tangent squared theta. The tangent squareds will cancel out, and all I have is 1, just like they wanted me to get. Okay, let's go look at 31. So 31 is going to again start off. I've got cosine squared plus 1 plus tangent squared. Ooh, that's something we just went over. If I see 1 plus tangent squared, I can rewrite that as secant squared. I'm going to do that first. That might make my life easy. So I'm going to have cosecant squared times secant squared. Remember, I'm trying to make it equal 1. And I know I can rewrite secant squared as a reciprocal of 1 over cosine squared. And now I can put this over 1, and I get cosine squared theta over cosine squared theta, and anything divided by itself is 1. All right, the last one, number 33. On number 33, they give me sine plus cosine squared plus sine minus cosine squared. So what you have to remember how to do is you have to remember how to square something. So when you square something, what you're really doing is you're foiling. So sine theta plus cosine theta squared just means you're going to have sine plus cosine, and I'll go add my thetas back at the end because I'm running out of room. Sine plus cosine. So I wrote it twice because I'm squaring it. And then I'm going to have sine minus cosine times sine minus cosine. You're going to go FOIL. So if I FOIL the first one, I get sine squared plus cosine sine plus cosine squared. I'm going to go FOIL the second one. I get sine squared minus cosine sine minus cosine sine plus cosine squared. Alright, so, ooh, I left one of these off. I said it twice, but I only wrote it once, cosine sine. So I've got sine squared theta plus 2 cosine sines plus cosine squared theta. That's with the purple. The red is sine squared theta minus 2 cosine sines plus cosine squared theta. Remember, everywhere I didn't write a theta, we should have one. I'm just not writing them because I'm running out of room. Alright, so I have a positive 2 cosine, I have a negative 2 cosine, so those are going to cancel out. And look at what I have here. I've got sine squared plus cosine squared, which I know my Phineas and Ferb, sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. And then I've got a sine squared plus a cosine squared again, so I have another 1, and 1 plus 1 is going to give me 2, which is what I was trying to get. Alright, so what I need for you to do is you need to go do the evens knowing they're just like what we did. And I only want you to do through 32. You're only trying to get through 32. You don't even have to do 34. You're trying to get all the way through 32 before you turn this into me. Alright, let me know what questions you have. Good luck.